Welcome to today's horror ghost stories, Mr. Boots. Hi guys, I just recently started listening to your podcast and it inspired me to send in my story. It happened in 2016 when I visited Edinburgh, Scotland for the very first time.
I went there with my parents and we had a wonderful long weekend there.
Enjoying both the culture, the architecture, and of course, the paranormal. As original tourists visiting a new place, we went on outings. Mary King's Close was a journey to say the least. Such a fascinating place with fascinating history.
My dad had a little experience there.
We were standing in an old kitchen. The guide had us all standing in a circle in that kitchen. To the left there was a room that was filled all the way to the ceiling with teddy bears and toys. We were told that a very famous ghost lived in there called Anne. She was continuously looking for a toy she had lost when she still lived. So visitors brought her all these toys and filled the room with them.
Anyway, we were standing in the circle and the guide was telling us about this kitchen.
My dad was standing straight across from me in this circle.
And I noticed he kept hitting his leg all the time.
As if there was a fly or something tickling his leg. When the tour was over, and we later sat at a bar with some drinks, I asked him about it. What was up with your leg down there in the kitchen?
He told me that it was so annoying.
It felt as if there were little fingers nipping out his leg hairs one by one. Without thinking about it, I just said, it was probably Anne. Kind of as a joke, but my dad ate it up. He was convinced it was her because he swore it felt like a little kid's fingers nipping out a hair one after the other. So I thought that was a fun little story there. My experience happened inside a bridge. This was also an excursion. This one wasn't guided though. We were shown a short clip inside before the guide, who locked us inside, let us look around on our own. The clip just explained what this part of the bridge was used for in the 1400s. Because of poverty and the plague, people were forced to keep warm and dry inside of this bridge. They had a kitchen and a hospital and beds, kind of. It was pretty much just a hole in the stone walls that people slept in. So we were given this pamphlet that explained everything and what each room was used for. It was very small and no electricity. So we used the flashlight on our phones and there were a few candles standing around the place. I felt totally normal down there. Nothing unusual other than the damp and cold air in the dark until the last room to explore was the only room down there that was painted. Walls and ceiling was painted white. My dad was standing in the doorway reading the pamphlet. I went inside and looked around. Immediately I felt uneasy.
I said to my dad, "Oh, it's real creepy in here."
I know how this sounds.
It's so weird.
But I started feeling threatened.
As if I was not in any way welcome in that room. And that if I didn't get the fuck out, I was going to get hurt.
I imagined inside my head that a figure was floating in the right-hand corner of the ceiling. A figure that was rather large and wore a long coat. Kind of like the fisherman in I Know What You Did Last Summer. Only he was wearing a hat, and not the sailor rain hat thing he wears in the movie.
I only saw a black silhouette and not like anything clear, if that makes sense.
Didn't see a face or anything. Anyway, I became scared inside that room. I felt threatened, and I am 100% convinced that if I stayed there for longer, I would have gotten hurt. I said to my dad,
"I can't be in here."
And I pushed myself past him to get out.
I almost knocked him over in the process.
Once out of that room, I felt totally fine again, like nothing had happened. The fear just evaporated, and I felt like I could breathe again. When we had seen everything, we let the guide know that we were ready to be let out. The guide asked us if we had any questions before we finished the experience. My hand shot up in the air right away, and I asked her if she could please tell her about the ghosts down here. She lit up by my question and was eager to tell us her stories. She told us about several things. A little boy that was roaming around down there, harmless. A hand she had seen come out from the stone wall. Just a hand, and then it went back inside. She told us about smells sometimes, sounds, about how scary it was to be on the last shift of the day, and be the one to walk around and blowing out the candle lights. But the scariest room, she said, is the white room my dad went.
"Oh my God, that's the room you didn't like and almost ran me over getting out of."
He was amazed. The guide went on to tell stories about Mr. Boots. explaining that the people who have seen him describe him as wearing a long leather coat and big boots on. So that's why he's being called Mr. Boots. Mr. Boots hates visitors. He does not like people being in that room. She said that her colleague had once been in that room to blow out a candlelight, and a male voice had whispered angrily in her ear, "Get out!" and she ran. She also told us about another tourist that had visited. She described them as a couple, where the man was a big buff guy, bald and full of tattoos. She had asked them before she let them inside if they believed in ghosts. And the man, of course, didn't, arms crossed and annoyed really by the whole thing. She didn't think much of it because people are all different. When they were let out, she noticed this man, pale as a ghost and kind of apathetic. The guide went over to them and asked if everything was okay. The wife just said, "Look at this," turned her husband around so his back was facing the guide and pulled his t-shirt up. All the way down his back, there were 3 very obvious and clear red scratch marks. The wife said it happened in the White Room. I haven't been scared like I was in that room since, and hopefully I never will. So that was my story. Due to my being Norwegian, there might be spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes. If you need to edit anything, you're of course welcome too. Thank you for reading my experience. Next story, Tiddukt Voice and Salt High there. I'd like for you to not share my name or email address. I've never told this story to anyone, and I don't want to chance anyone I know reading this and knowing it was me. I know that's a long shot though. When I was 20 plus years ago, and first moved out of my parents' house and into my own apartment, I had an experience that scared me so bad that I literally dream about it weekly to this day. I had only been living in my apartment for about 3 months.
Everything was fine.
I hadn't heard or seen anything that I would consider spooky or paranormal. I mean, like anyone else deals with daily, my keys would not be where I thought I had just left them, or my shoes would be in a different part of the apartment than I thought. I had just been promoted to manager of the little store I worked at, so I just blamed me losing things on being tired and overwhelmed at work. One night, I had just arrived home and was taking off my shoes when I heard a voice come from my bedroom.
I couldn't understand what it said, but I could tell it was a woman or a young boy.
My only door into the apartment had been locked, and I was pretty sure my windows were too, so I was certain there was no one in my bedroom. I figured it was probably something outside or a neighbor. I quietly, just in case, walked to my room and looked in, but there was no one there. My window was locked and there was no one outside. I thought it was weird, but figured there was an explanation. About an hour later, I was sitting down to eat dinner when I heard the voice again. This time, I swear, I know this sounds crazy, but I heard the same voice come from under my dining table, and this time I could tell it was a woman.
I don't have neighbors beneath me, so it wasn't that.
And I'm sure I heard the voice say something like all of them, or I love him.
I couldn't quite tell.
But I freaked out and started looking everywhere. My neighbor on that side of the apartment was a large guy, so I know that voice wasn't him. He also works nights, so he wasn't even home. There's no way that mostly clear voice came from anywhere but my apartment. Over the next hour or so, I heard the voice a couple more times in different parts of the apartment. I seriously just stood in the center of my apartment and listened. I was so scared, but also kind of fascinated and convinced I'd realize the rational explanation any second. After a while of not hearing the voice, I decided to do a little bit of a ritual to keep the spirit away from me. I lit an incense and walked from room to room with it. While doing that, I sprinkled this chunky sea salt I had around the doors and windows. Somewhere, I heard that was supposed to keep a ghost contained or prevent it from coming into a space. After an hour or so of not hearing anything else, I decided to go to sleep. I was still so freaked out that I decided to sleep on the couch so I could have the TV on. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Nothing had happened overnight that I know of. I went to work and told myself I was being silly.
I heard a bird in the roof, or somehow it really was one of my neighbors.
By the time I got home from work, I had pretty much convinced myself I had been overreacting. When I came into the apartment, everything seemed normal. I was so sure I had made it up that I just marched right in as if nothing had ever happened. My evening was normal. There was no voice or strange sounds.
I had honestly just about forgotten about the whole thing.
But that night when I went to bed, I felt like I was laying on little bits of gravel. It was everywhere in my bed between the sheets. I turned on the lights, convinced it was bugs. I don't know what to say about that. Guess I'm scared enough of bugs to jump right to that. It was not bugs. It was salt. Chunky sea salt. I looked around in front of the doors and windows because where else would it have come from? There was no salt on the floor anywhere. Not that I could see anyway.
But there was a good cup of it in my bed that was made.
And I hadn't slept in the night before. I broke my lease 2 weeks later. My landlord either wasn't interested in the reason or he wasn't surprised. Thanks. Next story. The Gate of No Return. Recently, I was listening to an episode on the Castle of Spirits. I usually just put the podcast on as a playlist so it runs in the background. And I don't know which episode it was, but it was about someone who heard panting under their bed. It was a super creepy story, which inspired me to write my first submission to the Castle of Spirits about my first paranormal experience, the growl.
And the rasp, this person also mentioned that they
would see scary faces floating around them when they closed their eyes, but only in their parents' bedroom. They had asked if anyone else had experienced anything like this or knew anything about it. I felt a sense of kinship with this person when I heard the story, and I wanted to mention that ever since I can remember, I periodically see images of things when I close my eyes. This can happen when I'm trying to fall asleep, when I'm waking up, or when I'm meditating. Sometimes it can happen in the space of a blink when I'm in mid-conversation with someone. It doesn't happen all of the time, but it happens enough and with enough variance that I am aware that there are different types of images we can see in our minds. I'm also aware that sometimes it's just static or visual noise our brain creates as we are winding down towards sleep or waking up from sleep. However, I am also aware that sometimes these images or visions come with intention and are a form of communication. I have learned this through the process of documenting the visions and finding out that some of them are precognitive, and some of them form a kind of repetitive symbolic vocabulary my subconscious mind uses to actually help me figure things out. The images are another way that information and intention can be communicated via energy that comes in clairvoyantly. I think that clairvoyance is a bit more common than we realize, but for most of us who are that way, we grew up thinking that everyone sees things when they close their eyes, sometimes lol. Either that or it was discredited by others that we just learned to bypass and ignore it. I actually had to remember this ability because I had so deeply suppressed it that it would go on in the background, and I didn't notice it. It wasn't until I became interested in studying psychic phenomena that I realized this happened to me. The thing to note is that if our subconscious can use images to speak to us, so can anything or anyone else who understands how to 1. Transmit information or intention in this way, or to 2. Has a strong enough energy and skill to broadcast its energy to any sensitive person within its influence. One thing to note is that sometimes a person may have a slight sensitivity to clairvoyance, but they can only receive visions when in the presence of someone or something that knows how to transmit. Like they have the ability, but it's not developed enough to happen without some help from a source that does, or, again, simply has powerful enough energy that the person sensing the energy picks up on it. For myself, I have experienced this type of phenomenon as flashes of images as if I were switching channels on a TV. The images may or may not be in color, may or may not move or be still, and may or may not seem related. The images can range from faces of people I know or don't know to trees, a table, a clock, or an image of a woman doing laundry by hand somewhere in India. It can seem pretty random sometimes, but other times, rather than flashes, the images form slowly out of light and often a preceding sensation in my body. The images seem to move across my vision and form into shapes as they move. It reminds me of the way that energy can and often does manifest as a type of mist that then takes the shape of a person and then vanishes. I've noticed this type of thing in many paranormal ghost encounters. It's the same experience, but it happens only in your field of vision when your eyes are closed. This type of experience sounded similar to what this person who saw the floating faces had experienced.
I've definitely seen faces like the ones they described before.
I have also experienced certain types of images being localized to specific locations. For instance, I didn't realize this until I went to Hawaii. I visited in 2021 and again in 2022. The first time I was there, I was doing a group meditation with my friends and I began to have flashes of totem faces. I hadn't even been there long enough to have seen any of these totem gods, and I was really surprised when I started to see them in my mind. I had never had visions of anything like that before, and it only seemed to happen when I was in Hawaii. I mentioned that I had to remember this ability to accept that it was there. That's because the reality is that this ability can something be terrifying, especially if you don't know what I know at this point. Even so, it can be very scary.
I think that one thing we do, especially as kids, is try to pretend the scary things that happened to us didn't actually happen.
I think a lot of time it's because we know that no one will believe us anyway, and we will be told it's not real. So, when we have no support or context for these frightening paranormal events, we learn to shut them out and even forget about them sometimes. My experience with catching myself doing this as an adult was one of the most horrific and disturbing psychic experiences of my life. I didn't want to acknowledge what I was seeing because it was awful, but once I got beyond the fear, I realized what was happening was also incredible. Someone or something wanted me to see something specific, and I realized I had the ability to receive information clairvoyantly. I was lying in bed one night in my mid-30s. I hadn't watched anything or read anything related to the theme of the images I began to see. I began to see flashing in color, repetitive images of African slaves and their experiences on the ships, or a ship that carried them to South America, I assume. I saw images of the Africans, and the focus was on the brutality and immense suffering that they endured on these journeys. I would see close-up images of infections on body parts due to the horrible living conditions. I saw the African people in chains, being abused and dying with immense suffering in the cargo holds of the ships. It was devastating and horrifying, and I was overwhelmed by the disturbing nature of these images, and they just would not stop coming. Once I accepted what was happening, I began to work on not just being frightened by it. I focused slowly on calming myself and asking if the images were coming from me. I knew they were not my images, and so I began to focus more and more on what felt like me and what did not. The more I focused on my own energy and on being calm, the less and less aggressively the images came. They began to fade into the background. I also made a point to acknowledge the images and the story I was being shown, realizing that possibly something wanted me to see and acknowledge this very sad and very terrible story. I did my best to do that and send love and acknowledgement. The weird thing about this story that didn't occur to me at all at the time is that when I was 19 years old, I had lived in West Africa in Benin for 3 months. I had been living and working on a hospital ship that provided medical services for the local villagers. During my off time, I would travel with my friend Josh to different places in the country. One day he took me to a place called Ouida. Not only was Benin said to be the birthplace of the voodoo religion, but it was also home to a historical beach that slavers had used to transport Africans who had been kidnapped both by slavers and other wearing African tribes onto the transport ships. I still have a photo of myself standing under a towering archway that had been made as a memorial to this terrible time in history. Carved on the top pillar of the archway was a line on either side of people in chains walking towards a ship at the center of the archway. I had also completely forgotten about this photo until I wrote this story to you right now. The archway is called the Gate of No Return. I am getting the chills. Even though it was at least 15 years before that experience of the visions, it was the only thing I could think of that made it make any sense.
I still don't fully understand why I had that experience when I did.
But it did teach me that it's very important to document these kinds of experiences so you can have a better opportunity to learn from them and not just be freaked out by them. I think that time doesn't work the same way in the world of energy, and this is why a lot of psychic experiences can be really confusing. But it does make me wonder about how all of these ghost stories that we simply find to be spooky and mysterious don't have some kind of backstory with depth and maybe even tragedy attached to them. Either way, I try my best to learn from them.
Next story, that's not Grandma. I know this sounds like a ghost story, and maybe it is, but I don't know.
Just something that happened to me. There's probably a rational explanation, but 15 years later, I still have no idea what that could be. Regardless, it's very true and remains the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. When I was 15, my mum and I moved into my grandmother's house to help her out. She was getting pretty old, losing her eyesight, and she had fallen down a few times. My parents were in the middle of a divorce, so it only made sense for everyone. The house was built sometime in the early 1900s, I think. My grandparents bought it sometime in the 60s, and my mom had grown up there. I never knew my grandpa, as he died long before I was born, but my mom always spoke fondly of him. My grandma, however, was a different story. She wasn't a monster or anything, but she wasn't terribly kind. She had a way of making you feel small, like everything about you exasperated her. She wasn't very loving, but she could be funny, and she was an amazing cook. I generally just tried not to talk too much when I was around her. Like I said, she was losing her sight, but she never failed to point out that I looked like a ragamuffin. That was her favorite thing to say to me. The house was old but had been kept up nicely. My mom took her old bedroom upstairs and next to my grandmother's bedroom. The basement was finished, so that was kind of my little area. Grandma never came down the stairs, so it was pretty private.
At first, everything was fine.
I kind of felt like a grown-up living in my own apartment. However, after a couple of weeks, I started to hear something I couldn't explain. The first time it happened, I was just getting into bed. It was around 11 p.m. and I had switched off my lamp and laid my head on the pillow. But before I could even close my eyes, I heard what sounded like a soft, dragging sound on the floor above me. I froze, not out of fear, but just in an effort to not make any noise so I could hear the sound more clearly.
I heard it again, and it sounded like it was moving its way across the entryway, which was directly over me.
It sounded like something not particularly heavy being dragged or pushed, like a box of books being nudged slowly across the floor.
I figured it was my mom or grandma and just went to sleep.
The next morning, I asked my mom if she had been up in the middle of the night, and she said no. She and my grandma had stayed up late talking, and she had fallen asleep in my grandmother's room that night. They had both slept soundly, she said.
I was a little freaked out by that, but shrugged it off.
What else could I really do? This happened pretty regularly, but I always found a way to justify it. I even tiptoed upstairs a few times when it was happening, but I never found anyone or anything that could have made the sound. One night, though, things changed. I was again going to bed around 11 when I heard the dragging sound very faintly. It sounded like it was in the kitchen, which is where the door to the basement was.
I crept out of bed, determined this time to get to the bottom of it.
I began making my way up the stairs as quietly as I could, but before I made it up more than 2, the door at the top of the staircase opened very slowly. I flipped on the light switch next to me, and I saw my grandma in her nightgown standing there, grinning down at me.
I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't that.
She looked normal, just like she always looked. Everything except the grin. It wasn't like a Hollywood horror movie grin or anything. Just a normal, close-mouthed smile. But that's why it felt wrong. My grandma was always quite dour. Even when making jokes, she maintained an air of disinterest and irritation. I told her, she startled me and asked if she needed something. She just stood there grinning. Grandma, I asked thinking she might not have heard me, or maybe she was sleepwalking. I took another step toward her and she turned and kind of shuffled away, leaving the door wide open. Weirded out but not afraid, I followed up the stairs, but she was nowhere to be seen. I quietly walked through the house to my grandmother's bedroom and saw that the light was on and she and my mother were sitting and chatting. I asked my grandma if she needed something from me, but she looked at me like I was dumb and just said no.
I asked why she opened the basement door, and my mum said they were just getting ready to call it a night and that Grandma hadn't left the room.
I swear as I turned to return to my room, my grandma looked right at me and grinned, just like she had at the top of the stairs.
I ran back to my bedroom and hid under the blankets.
I couldn't understand what had just happened. A few weeks later, my grandma passed away in her sleep. Since she had no other family, we got the house and decided to stay. About a week after her memorial service, the dragging sounds started again, but now I refused to go look for them. I lived in that house for the next 3 years until I went off to college. At least 4 other times that I know of, that door at the top of the stairs slowly creaked open in the middle of the night. And once, I swear, I hear soft footsteps padding down to the basement. Thankfully, my mum sold that house a few years later. I drive past it every once in a while and I can't help but wonder if the new owners experience anything. I've thought about knocking on the door and telling them it used to be my family's house and asking if I could look around, but I don't think I could do it.
What if I saw her by the stairs?
Or heard the dragging sound again? Next story, Key Phantom Animals. This is a story about animal spirits or ghosts. It's 2 stories, actually, but the first one leads into the second in an important way that gives more weight to both accounts. I think that most of us, at some point, have had the experience of seeing something out of the corner of our eyes that turns out not to be there. I think a lot of times we can write this off to being tired or our brain misfiring and interpreting a rock, a tree, or a pile of clothes into a figure of some kind. The question I often ask myself is, just because it doesn't remain in your field,
A vision, when you look at it, does that mean it never existed? Or does it mean it doesn't exist somewhere else in another plane of awareness? I have a lot of questions about this phenomenon.
seeing weird things out of the corner of my eyes is something I've personally gotten used to. I don't pay much attention unless something else definitive happens to tell me it wasn't just my brain being weird or tired. I've learned over time that most of my family members and close friends have these experiences as well, of seeing phantoms that are only visible until you look at them. We laugh about it a lot. Some of the stories are ridiculous and silly, but others are confounding or spooky. I started to really notice this in terms of animals and seeing animals out of the corner of my eyes. I became aware of this back when I still lived in the forest. It wasn't far from where I am now, but it was further up next to the Sierra National Forest, along a creek. I would notice them all the time. The fun part was when it would actually be an animal standing there, like a deer or a skunk or a squirrel. But most of the time it was just those strange phantoms that disappeared when you look at them directly. One evening, my husband and I had decided to walk up the road together. It took us through a beautiful and winding section of the woods. It was just before dusk, lulling in that liminal space of sunset. I had begun to notice about 5 minutes into the walk that I kept seeing little things out of the corner of my eyes. I knew better than to say anything and just kept enjoying the walk. I almost giggled a few times because there seemed to be a lot of them that evening, but I wasn't about to mention that to my husband. He simply wasn't into that kind of thing. I have become aware that this kind of phenomenon seems to increase at certain times or maybe in specific locations. I haven't figured it out, but I was amused and somewhat confounded by how much it was happening that particular evening. My husband had been chatting away about something while we were walking. I was listening and noticing the weird occurrences I kept seeing along the road. Suddenly he stopped talking mid-sentence and turned to me with a strange look on his face. "This is crazy," he said. "I swear I keep seeing things out of the corner of my eyes, like animals." "I see them too," I said. He went on to describe to me that he's been noticing it a lot lately and how strange he thought it was. This was the first time my husband and I had ever shared in an experience like that. I'm still not sure if it had to do with the energy of where we lived or something else, as I later learned that this kind of thing happened in other places too. I didn't consider my husband to be psychic to a visual degree. He had powerful intuition and a sense about things, but he didn't ever see things. So this was strange indeed. The next experience was the weirdest one of them all because we were not at home. It was in the early morning, and the sighting involved more than just us. We had been visiting a greenhouse in San Francisco, buying plants for our tropical plant store. We always went down late and drove most of the night, so I was used to being tired and a little out of it while I was there. I loved it though. We would get there right when they opened, when it was quiet and fresh. The misty greenhouse filled with plants in the morning had its own ethereal and vitalizing quality to it, and the rows of varying tropical plants seemed to go on forever. As I was pushing my big pallet cart through the aisles of plants, I noticed a little dog out of the corner of my eye. He was very clear in my mind, even though I only caught a flash of his image in the main walkway. He looked like a little scraggly blonde-haired terrier. I turned to say hello to him and realized he wasn't actually there. I took note of the occurrence, checked to make sure no one was observing me, and kept on shopping. Only a few minutes later, I saw him again. He looked like a Benji-type dog and seemed to be following me around the greenhouse. Again, I just took note of him and kept doing what I was doing. There wasn't much else to do. Every time I looked directly at him, he wasn't there anymore. Then, just like before, my husband approached me in a hushed tone and said, "I swear, I keep seeing this little scruffy-looking dog out of the corner of my eye." I smiled at him. "You mean the little Benji dog?" I asked. His eyes got wide and he was excited. "Yes. Oh my God, that's freaky. You saw the same one?" he exclaimed. Over time, I have learned to keep quiet about these experiences. I don't like to advertise that I sometimes see things other people don't. I just notice and keep calm unless I have a good reason to talk about it. My husband was not as familiar with these types of experiences and didn't have the trepidation I do about sharing.
I almost died of embarrassment when Mai excitedly announced to one of the greenhouse managers what we had seen. We knew this woman by name and she was very familiar with us. She had seemed like a very practical person. "We keep seeing this little ghost doggy," he said. To my surprise, the manager smiled calmly. "Oh yeah, they seem to really like it here. We see little ghost cats and dogs all of the time." I could tell she was serious and not putting us on. "We think it has to do with the environment. It just attracts them for some reason. They like it here." I marveled at that experience, and I still do. It makes me wonder what would draw spirit cats and dogs to such a place. Not that I could blame them. It was a wonderfully peaceful place to hang out. It was also strange to me how matter-of-fact the manager was about it. I suppose it encouraged me at that time to feel a little less weird and validate my experiences a little bit more. I don't know if these things happen for a reason, or if they just happen. I think sometimes they do, but not always. I wonder what you would think about that. Next story, the knock. I recall this with vivid clarity, even though now 65, occurred when I was approximately 20 and in my first 2 years of college. I was at home and my mother and sister told me they were headed out, I think they said the mall, around 6:30 in the evening. It was getting dark, so it must have been November of that year. As I recall, they told me my father was working late. As they left, all the lights in the house were turned off, and I made sure all the doors were locked. I was getting ready to do some chemistry homework. As I recall, it had to do with the pH of orange juice solutions. Told you I remember this vividly. As I proceeded to my room to start on my homework, I remember closing the door, and a very strange thought entered my mind. Someone is going to knock on the door, and when you open it, no one will be there. It's the devil. What an odd thought. Anyway, I closed the door and moved to my desk to start my homework. No sooner than I had sat down, there was knock on my bedroom door. I was freaked. I know my heart was pounding. And briefly, looking at my green push-button phone, landline, I thought of calling the police. But to tell them what?
After disposing of that thought, I convinced myself I had no choice but to open the door, knowing that I must have heard something else I mistook for a knock. I opened the door, looking into the darkness, and of course there was no one there. Suddenly, perhaps over 2 or 3 seconds, my uncle appears into view. He is wearing a black suit and tie and said hello, and I asked how he got in. He told me the door was open and he came in and saw the light at the bottom of the room door. You would not have seen that from either of the 2 entry doors at opposite sides of the house. He said he was there to speak with my father. This was his brother, my uncle. I told him he wasn't home and was working late. He told that was fine, but since he was there, he thought he would just visit with me for a few minutes, if I had the time, just to catch up. Of course, I said yes. He had asked about many items, but basically related to mentally controlling items, creating movements, etc. He said I had the capability. I thought that was odd, but I humored him. After about 30 minutes, when I could not do what he was trying to show me, he said it was time for him to leave and let my father know he had come by for a visit. Later that evening, when my father came in, I told him about the visit and he called his brother. I recall my father's surprise when he told me his brother had not come by and he did own a black suit. I don't know what happened or why, but that specific event being visited never occurred again. It was about a year later, when I was in my parents' room watching the TV, when my younger sister came in and we had commented when we both heard the back door open and close, it had a large glass panel that would vibrate when the door was closed, that my father had come home early, after he didn't appear. Then we
Initially started commenting about things.
many that I had experienced, and she shared what she had experienced, including a repeated visit she had.
Prayed for years. When we told my father,
He told us about the many times he would be in my parents' bedroom and would hear someone knocking on the front door. It was persistent enough that he would look out the window in the bedroom and could see no one at the front door. He had other stories as well. My mother and older brother claim they have never experienced. However, that knock really had everything coalesce. Everything stopped after a full-scale upgrade to the house, including my sister's visitor. We still talk about this to this day. My father passed in 2016. In an unrelated event during one Christmas, we talked about these events and my brother had said he never experienced anything. Then I reminded him. He recalled those old cassette tapes he had of recordings he had made, but left the recorded on beyond what he needed. In those cassettes, you can hear in the background voices, but we could never make them out. He always said he was picking up stray radio signals. Thanks for letting me share. Next story. Spirits on the land. There have always been spirits that live on the land where I grew up in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. My 4 siblings and I always knew our house was haunted when we were little,
and not a single one of us escaped our childhood without at least one.
and in some cases many ghostly encounters. It wasn't until adulthood, after a divorce that caused me to move back home, that I realized it wasn't just the houses on the land that were haunted. Whatever it was about where we lived, it had been on the land first. And whatever was on the land was what made it a kind of intersection for supernatural energies. Once I had been back home for a while,
I began to hear stories from our next-door neighbor.
I had lived next to her my whole life and never knew that she too was sensitive to spirits, and she had stories about the land as well. Those are stories I will share at another time. My little sister, possibly the most physically sensitive of the 4 siblings, never left the land. She moved to a small cottage on the edge of the wood, near the creek and a large blackberry field at the edge of the property. We had both noticed a somewhat darker shift on the land over the past 2 years. We had both been experiencing it for a while before we spoke about it one night. It was like the balance was somehow off. I had a strong sense one afternoon while tending to her dogs while she was at work that it was time for us to do something about the darker energy on the land. I could feel that the time was ripe to draw the energy towards something more harmonious, but it would take something special, something intentional. Due to our upbringing, we have both developed our practice of what I would call a land-based folk spiritualism. It combines an array of other, more traditional spiritual practices and beliefs with our own particular twists. We planned out a ritual ceremony for the full moon. We both felt the energy was centered somewhere out in the blackberry field beyond my sister's cottage. Neither of us felt comfortable going out there at night, so we decided to do it at dawn. It's always good to do these things in a liminal space like dawn or dusk.
Did some divination and both felt into what we wanted to bring. We wanted to offer the
restless spirits on the land a place to finally rest and make a statement of our intent to hold a space of harmony and stewardship.
Of the land and the people here, the morning of the ritual.
I gathered all of my implements, put on my ceremonial clothes, and headed out towards the open field. It's an odd and flat clearing in an otherwise dense wood, nestled against the southern edge of a heavily forested ridge. The clearing exists because ranchers used to raise cattle on our land back in the 1940s and 50s. Before that, it's pretty clear that indigenous Native Americans lived here. The land is teeming with wildlife. We have bears, raccoons, that's right, Vince, raccoons, skunks, mountain lions, bobcats, snakes, and all kinds of birds live here. There are large families of ravens and wild turkeys that make their rounds on our land pretty much every day. All year round, I had noticed the large group of turkeys gobbling their way up from where they nested each night in the towering dead ponderosa pines that ran along the creek. This year, they were about 20 strong. I remember the frosty cold that morning as I made my first stop at the edge of the field. We had done a winter burn pile there only a few days earlier. I had felt compelled at the time to bless the fire, wanting to emphasize leaving behind the old and ushering in the new. I had planned to use some of the ash from the blessed fire to add more potency to our Eandavor. I bent over to gather the ash in a jar, and when I stood back up and turned around, what I saw was a little bit more than strange. The flock of turkeys had approached me quietly and stood maybe 15 feet away from me. This was highly unusual for the birds, as they tend to be skittish and easily frightened, scattering at the slightest sound or movement. The birds all stared at me,
as if they were waiting for something. Wild birds can act like this if you feed them regularly, and they recognize you.
But I had never once fed these turkeys. I had a funny kind of creeping feeling as I stepped forward slowly, that the ritual had begun the moment I had set foot outside that morning. The turkeys lined up behind me in a group and followed me slowly, like a strange procession. I kept looking back to see if it was actually happening. It was.
And they followed me closely for the entire length of the field,
which ended at my sister's small cottage. Now, I've done enough of this kind of thing in the past to realize that when you are listening to the energy of the land, if you are sensitive to it, it will let you know when you are doing what it wants. I feel like this kind of thing goes way back and sets deep in our bones that we aren't always meant to move the land. More often than not, the land moves us. When we learn to move with the land, we can connect to something deep, instinctive, and primal. I also think that if you grow up in a specific place that still has enough wildness to it, where the nature around you is still the dominant force, the land can more easily speak to you and even protect you at times. It knows you, just like the animals that live on the land come to know you too. This was what went through my mind as I stopped at the path to my sister's house. The turkeys slowly dispersed, and as I walked away, I felt a sense, like the spirit of the land was telling me it was watching me. I had only wished that my sister had been watching and had gotten a photo of the turkey procession. So you would know I'm not making this up. Our ritual went beautifully,
even though we shivered through the whole thing.
We both felt we had accomplished the first half of our intentions. Any good ritual takes time to marinate or germinate, especially if it's land-based. The first ritual on the full moon was about opening a line of communication, or a door, if you will. The last ritual on the new moon would be sealing and ending the conversation. The last ritual did take place at dusk and into the night, out in the berry field. What happened there was another story, and it's best not to discuss the workings of any ritual. What we expressed was our understanding that life is a balance of both light and dark, and that we wanted to help hold the line that kept the darkness in its proper place, not able to run rampant. We knew this required something of us, and we expressed our willingness to give what was necessary, and we invited the spirits of the land to show us. The sense of foreboding fear we had both felt for so long quickly dissolved within and around us over the next day.
And it has continued to do so. However, we did not escape this process without something truly disturbing happening.
Oddly, also involving birds. The second morning after the ritual, my mother came in from her usual morning chores, and her face was white and she looked upset.
As if in a daze, sometime in the night, 10 of our 13 chickens had been killed.
Something had dug a small hole in the cup in order to get to them. The disturbing part about the deaths is that only one chicken had been mostly eaten. The rest had had their necks broken and only one single bite mark on their body.
As if they had been drained of their blood. To make it even more strange, almost all of the dead birds had been buried to the point we couldn't see them,
in a perfect straight line that led towards the hole in the coop. I pondered all of this deeply while I unearthed each of our birds and put them in a wheelbarrow. There was a sinking feeling in my stomach like a rock, and I was afraid that I had somehow caused this. Now, it's not actually unheard of for this kind of thing to happen. Bobcats, for instance, will do things like this if they have a bigger kill than they can eat. But we had kept chickens for about 15 years, and nothing like that had ever happened. So it was hard for me not to think it strange that this had begun with very strange behavior from the wild birds, and seemed to have ended with the death of 10 domestic birds. I said goodbye to each bird, and then wheeled them out into the woods, wanting to draw the predator away from the coop, as it would clearly return the next night for more. I took them to the old tree we call Mama Tree, an old cedar that is prolific in producing saplings, and I laid the chickens out, offering them back to the land, so that their deaths would feed life. I couldn't help but feel that the deeper mystery of what it actually is to live in harmony with the land, and what that actually means, that I didn't understand. One thing is for sure, I believed then and believe even more now, the land is always willing to teach us, but it's not always neat and tidy. Death is always tied to life, and maybe that was part of the lesson. The dark feeling continued to dissipate, even in the wake of the chicken massacre. Luckily, the land spared 3 of our precious chickens, and we take great care to lock them in their laying box each night, protecting them from the wildness of where we live. I look forward to a summer of fearless interactions with our beautiful land. Hopefully, there will be many more strange stories to come. Next story, Uninvited Entity. Hello, Jane and Vince. This will be one of those long stories you might skip over, but I hope you give it a read. There is no resolution, as I have no idea what the entity was that was in our house. I have to give some background as to some experiences that involved him that are relevant to the terrifying experience we had. My son, now 31, was about 3 years old at the time of this incident. At one point, in the same house, he had come up alongside me and started to say, "Mummy, and then paused, pointed into the kitchen and asked me, "Who's that?" I peered into the kitchen, not seeing anyone.
I asked him who he was talking about, and he said right there, like I was an idiot.
I knew he was seeing something that I could not, so I asked him what the person looked like, whether like me, or Grandpa, or Grandma. He said Grandma. Then his eyes followed whatever he was seeing obviously walk out of the kitchen and out the front door. He then resumed with his question he had originally come in to ask me, like nothing happened. I realized he had what I originally called a gift, that I would later decide not to help him home because of the main experience I'm writing about. It would become obvious to me that he was a magnet for not only benign and today's, but those that could cause harm, and he had none of the tools to protect himself at his age. This next part is relevant to another incident, and it will become clear why I included it. He used to sit on the floor of the kitchen playing with his toys while my aunts, mother and I would sit around the table drinking coffee and chatting. He would repeat what he was hearing us talk about in a completely monotone voice. No inflection at all, just repeating what he was hearing without any emotion. After my father died, he was crying, knowing he wouldn't see his grandfather again. I was in the dining room speaking with the hospice nurse, holding him, facing towards my back. All of a sudden he stopped crying and said in a monotone voice, "I'll see you again." Both the hospice nurse and I stared at each other with wide eyes.
She said, "Did he just..."
And all I could do was nod. Just as in the kitchen he was repeating what he heard. He and my father were thicker than thieves, attached at the hip, and I didn't exist whenever those two were with each other. So I didn't find it surprising that my father was saying goodbye to him.
When I asked my son what he just saw, he yelled nothing
And resumed crying. This brings us to the incident in our house that was so terrifying. My son had always been a happy child and wasn't prone to fantasy, as hard as that is to believe about a child. He's always been an old soul and far beyond his years. We had just finished watching a show and we were on our way for him to go to bed. I was holding his hands, which were above his head. He was in front of me.
and we were singing something and kind of dance, walking down the hall, when he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks and was trembling so badly I had no idea what was happening. I kind of chuckled and said, "What are you doing, silly?"
My usually articulate son was pointing down the hall and stuttered out, "Monster!" Mind you, a split second before this, we were laughing without a care in the world. No child at the age of 3 has the capacity to go from that to absolutely terrified in a split second, as if they plan to just freak you out. So I know he was actually seeing something. I know you like to run a clean show, but I'm going to tell you what I said verbatim, and you can decide whether to use it as is or edit. After he pointed and said monster,
My mama bear kicked in and I did the one thing they tell you never to do. I confronted whatever was in our house. I yelled out, "Get the fuck out of our house. You're not welcome or invited. I will follow too through the bowels of hell if you continue to threaten my child."
Looking back, I can't believe I took such a risk, but my son was my whole world, and it was obvious this thing was targeting him because I couldn't see it.
I didn't think, I just acted. My son visibly relaxed, so I knew the entity was gone.
Needless to say, he slept with me that night.
I wasn't going to let him out of my sight.
The next day, he was his normal self, so cautiously we went back to our routine. He didn't dwell on it, but I haven't stopped thinking about it in almost 3 decades. I have no idea what kind of horrifying thing he saw was. Whatever it was not good because of his reaction. And after seeing what he perceived as a grandma-like figure in our kitchen that did not upset him, I can only conclude this entity was some kind of evil. I've had experiences with the paranormal myself over the decades, and as I said, I tried to be aware of anything happening with my son seeing things. He used to have prophetic dreams, not about major world events, just little things that he'd tell me about that would come to fruition within days. Other than that, thankfully, he didn't mention seeing any more entities. To gain more understanding, I wish I could have seen what he saw in our hallway. To this day, I don't know what it was or why it was there. I can only assume my son was like a beacon, being so young and innocent. I'm just glad my actions that night didn't backfire and cause even more events like it. Thank you for reading. And if you have any insight as to what he may have seen, I'd be open to getting some resolution. Love the podcast and appreciate you taking the time to read this. I have other experiences not quite so terrifying if you're interested.
I'm just relieved to know there's some good mixed in with the horrifying events in our lives.
Next story, Haunted Brick Church Road. My name is Miranda Terry. I'm 28, and I grew up in the small southern town of Sellersburg, Indiana. I got into spooky paranormal things as a young kid, even if they kept me up at night.
I still love paranormal stuff to this day.
However, it took me nearly 10 years to realize I'd had a paranormal experience myself. I ran cross-country throughout school, and one of our usual routes past Brick Church Cemetery, just beyond the 2.5-mile mark on a rural back road. I always felt a little creeped out there, but nothing major. The summer after senior year, I was on a solo run and turned around right after the bridge near the cemetery. As I turned around to head back, I glanced left and saw what looked like a white, pointed sheep bouncing just above the treetops, like someone riding an invisible horse.
My stomach dropped.
I panicked and sprinted as fast as I could until I was a safe distance away. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a deer or debris, but it made no sense. The shape, the motion, and the overwhelming fear I felt stayed with me. Years later, after watching countless paranormal shows, it finally clicked.
I hadn't imagined it. I'd likely seen a spirit, possibly something replaying an event from long ago.
That cemetery already had ghost stories surrounding it, and the only piece of information that makes my experience make sense is a rudimentary article on druidic cults in the area, in which people or beings a part of that group wear cloaks. Even though I'm agnostic, I believe there are beings and realms beyond this world that we just can't explain and often don't believe until we experience them for ourselves. Next story. A farewell visito. For a long while now, I have believed that our family members can become our protectors when they pass. I am aware that even if they don't fully stay behind, a part of them does that, and they want to see how their loved ones fare in life and be sure to meet us on the other side to help us when we pass. I never knew my real grandfather on my mother's side very well. He had estranged himself from my family in many ways, although he began to connect more with my mother once he knew he was dying.
I never had any contact with him during that time.
I had decided that since he had had so little interest in me when he was well, I didn't want to put the energy into him at the end of his life. It was just what felt right to me at the time. This is my story about what I experienced when my grandfather Edward died. At the time of his passing, I had been doing a lot of study into psychic awareness and meditation. I know I had been drawn to study this on my own because it is a big part of my life, but I also think I was being drawn more to deep contemplation on this because of my grandfather. One day after meditating, I began to get a strange sense that I needed to prepare myself to see an actual spirit. This was such a weird awareness as I wasn't normally focused on things like that, but I noted that intuition while meditating one morning.
I had never actually seen a ghost and wondered if I wouldn't just pass out from fright if I ever did.
I had this sense of something telling me I needed to practice the idea of staying calm if I saw a ghost with my own eyes, and I innately knew that the more excited or scared I got, the harder it would be to keep seeing something like that. A few nights later, I was lying in bed, almost asleep. My then husband had stayed up to watch one of his Netflix shows, and I had gone to bed early. I was just about to drift off when I had the distinct sense of someone in the room. I opened my eyes and saw in the dim light that a tall man was approaching my side of the bed. There was just enough light in the room to show the outline and the shape of this person. At first, I assumed it was my husband coming to kiss me goodnight, because I felt a sense of warmth and familiarity from him. My husband was 6'6" and hard to mistake. But just before he reached me, I had the strangest feeling, and I reached over to the other side of the bed. To my amazement and confusion, my husband was already in bed, asleep next to me. As I kept my eye on the figure in front of me, realizing there was a strange man in my room, I watched him dissolve into nothingness right in front of my eyes. I lay there for a long time, wide-eyed and reiterating to myself that I had not been asleep, what had happened, and that I had indeed watched this person disappear right in front of my eyes. I wondered what it was that had allowed me to see him, and what had been the cause of him disappearing. I had thought that maybe being between sleeping and waking had made me more receptive to seeing this, but once I realized it wasn't a physical person, my mind couldn't handle it. I'm still not sure, but as strange as that was, got even weirder a few days later. Now, I always recommend recording what you experience.
Even if it makes no sense, and always be open to finding.
More to the story, a lot of paranormal experiences. Have ended up having synchronicities connected to them that tell me more about what they are for or why they are happening. To me, back to the story, I was over at my mum's house and she had just returned from handling my grandfather's affairs with her brother up in Oregon. She had brought back some items and included among them was a box of old photos. I had met my grandfather Edward once when I was 14.
At that time, he was already an old man. I found a photo of a group of people standing on the front porch of a house.
I noticed a tall, lean man who reminded me instantly of my now ex-husband. The similarities in their features were very noticeable.
That's when I felt the chills creeping up my spine.
I realized it was a photo of my grandfather in his 40s. I would never have recognized him as the old man I'd met as a teenager. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place in my mind. This was the man I had seen approach me in my room a few nights before. Of course, I could be wrong, but the timing was a bit uncanny, and I know what I saw and felt. This person had come to say goodbye, which I interpreted as the intention to say goodnight. I could feel the energy of protective love coming from him. It was very, very strange. One thing I have learned since, as this was my first experience with losing a grandparent or family member, is that for me, there is always an element of paranormal activity that happens when a family member passes. My boyfriend Chris has experienced the same thing, and there is another story I will submit that talks about a shared experience of such family-related paranormal activity. What I notice is that when a family member is either close to death or recently passed, it's as if the veil between the living and the dead gets thinned. This is because spirits, often other family members who have passed, come to help us when we pass or are getting ready to pass. If you are sensitive like my family and me, those spirits may also visit you. Years later, when the grandfather I had been close to had passed, my mother and I both noticed an increase in strange and unexplainable paranormal activity in our house. My mum heard 3 loud knocks at the back door and found no one there. She questioned the neighbour and my siblings who live on the same property, and they said no one had done it. I stood out in the yard watering the plants with my dog, Butter, a sweet and sassy little French bulldog. I heard my brother's voice say my dog's name quietly, and in a silly voice like only he could. I walked around the corner asking him what he was doing at the house so early, only to find I was talking to space. I immediately said out loud, "Who's here?" "Who said that?"
I knew I was asking a spirit, not a person.
There was no way it could have been my brother, as he was at home with his family when that happened, and no one else was around. I never got an answer, but I marked that moment in my mind as an authentic paranormal experience. Even though I wasn't scared, thinking about the disembodied voice still gives me the chills. I don't know what either of those experiences mean, just that my mother and I both were being visited by paranormal activity just after my grandfather passed.
I already had the experience with my grandpa, Edward, to draw on.
So perhaps I was a bit more ready this time. These experiences have taught me a lot about the idea of familiar spirits and the interest that the dead of our bloodlines, or those we have strong connections with before they die, keep in us after they die. Many hauntings are about the spirits wanting to protect or connect with someone they once knew, or maybe someone who reminds them of someone they once knew. I have now recorded multiple experiences related to family members passing, and with each experience I am filled with wonder, joy, and encouragement that death is not the end and that we are not left alone when we pass to the other side.